In the small town of Livingston, in the middle of Montana, winter was always relentless. On that particular January day, a heavy snowfall blanketed everything in a thick layer of white, making even the simplest of steps difficult. James Matthews, 42, had lived here for almost a decade, working silently in his auto repair shop on the side of the state highway. His face, partially covered with surgical scars and a thick beard, warded off curious glances, but it didn't hide the eyes marked by something deeper than pain, a kind of resigned emptiness. Few knew that he was a U.S. Navy veteran, quietly decorated and just as quietly forgotten. James preferred it that way. Fewer questions, fewer memories. That morning, he had opened his shop just to check on a faulty generator. He wasn't expecting customers. He wasn't expecting anything, to be honest. It was around 9:30 a.m. when the headlights of a white SUV appeared through the fog, flashing for help. The vehicle seemed to slide sideways until it came to a complete stop on the shoulder, a few meters from the garage entrance. James, unhurried and already accustomed to desperate drivers in extreme conditions, put on his worn parka, adjusted his beanie, and walked to the car. In the driver's seat, a woman with a worried expression quickly got out. She wore military fatigues under a thick coat, and her dark brown hair, tied back in a bun, showed signs of exhaustion. The battery died, and the engine has been acting funny since yesterday, she said, trying to brush the snow off the hood. James nodded silently, but before opening the engine, he noticed something that made him stop for a moment. The name tag hanging from the collar, Captain Alexis Kelly, U.S. Army. A name that, no matter how buried in James's mind, carried too much weight to ignore. James didn't answer right away. He stood there, staring at the name on his badge as if his mind were trying to cross a decade in seconds. Alexis noticed his look, but dismissed it as a common oddity. People often reacted strangely to the sight of a high-ranking woman, especially in such a small town. "Are you okay?" she asked, adjusting her cap, which the wind insisted on blowing away. James just nodded, not looking up. Her name echoed in his head with increasing force, as if memories were being pulled from a dusty vault. He remembered the medical tent in the Tagab Valley vividly, the thick smoke, the smell of blood, the searing pain on the right side of his face, and her steady, controlled voice telling him to keep breathing, even when all seemed lost. She had kept him alive, but she believed he had died in the evacuation. Without revealing anything, James opened the hood and began to examine the cables. The battery was frozen, the engine on the verge of failure. "It'll take about 2 hours. You can wait inside. There's a heater and coffee," he said, his voice still low, as if he were measuring each word. Alexis hesitated for a few seconds. She looked around, saw that the wind was starting to whip up the snow in spirals, and decided to accept. When she entered the workshop, she felt the heat of the gas heater, the smell of grease and aged wood. There were few things in the place: a tool table, an old radio playing instrumental country music, 2 chairs, a rusty coffee pot. She took off her coat, hung it carefully, and sat down, looking around. James came in shortly after, still wearing his oily gloves, and poured her a steaming cup of coffee. For a few minutes the silence remained. She had no idea who he was. And he, now sitting across from her, was still trying to believe that she was real. James wasn't good with words, and he wasn't one to initiate conversation, especially with someone who carried so much weight in his history. He watched her discreetly as she sipped her coffee, looking at the details of the shop as if searching for something familiar. Alexis commented on the cold, how dangerous the road was, and mentioned that she was on her way to a nearby base where she would be attending a medical event for veterans. When she said the word veterans, James took a deep breath. It was as if fate were trying to pull them back to where they had come from, as if this meeting had been more than a coincidence. Finally, he broke the silence. "You were in Afghanistan, right? The Northeast?" Alexis looked at him in surprise. "Yes, I was. Tagab Valley, 10 years ago." The name made his stomach turn. He nodded slightly and murmured, "I was there too." Alexis narrowed her eyes, trying to pull something from her memory. James's face, despite the deep lines, seemed to trigger something inside her. She set the mug down slowly. "What was your unit?" she asked, almost cautiously. James answered without looking directly at her. 212 Battalion, Echo Platoon. The answer fell like a silent blow between them. Alexis put her hand to her mouth, as if trying to contain her emotion. There was a sergeant. Matthews. He was badly wounded in an ambush. I was the field medic that day. Time stood still. James looked up, and for the first time, looked at her directly. "I'm Matthews," he said without embellishment, as if simply delivering a truth and waiting for what would come next. The silence that followed was thick, filled with shock, disbelief, and something approaching relief. Alexis took a few seconds to process. She slowly rose from her chair, her eyes brimming with tears. She approached James with careful steps, as if she feared he would disappear. "But they said you didn't survive the evacuation. I spent years thinking I had failed you." Her voice cracked between words. James remained seated, but his expression began to fall. "They told me you died in the helicopter explosion that followed. I thought that was the last time I saw you alive." The reality was that they had both lived 10 years in silent mourning, each believing the other had been swallowed up by the war. Alexis sat back down, her hands shaking this time. The woman who saved lives every day looked fragile for the first time. James, on the other hand, for the first time in years, did not feel alone in his story. The next few hours passed like an old movie being rewound. Alexis asked to hear everything, and James told her, pausing, breathing heavily, about what had happened after the evacuation, about the endless surgeries, the years of rehabilitation, the strange looks he'd received when he'd returned, the questions he'd avoided, and the silence he'd chosen as a refuge. She listened with rapt attention, sometimes closing her eyes, as if absorbing every word. When he mentioned how he'd barely survived, thanks to a civilian nurse who'd taken him in for the first few months after his discharge, Alexis pressed her lips together, containing a mixture of relief and pain. "I tried to find out who survived, but no one knew about you. And I gave up. I thought it was cowardly of me to keep serving after that," she confessed. The connection between them, made of scars and shared memories, was beginning to re-establish itself there, not as something that needed to be resolved, but as something that could finally be shared. Outside, the blizzard continued to pound the road, but inside the garage, time seemed to have slowed down. Alexis, still processing everything, stood up and began to pace in small circles, as if her body needed to move to digest her emotions. "You should have been honored. That day, you saved 2 soldiers by carrying them on your back, even with half your face burned off. I remember, everyone remembers," she said, looking at James with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. He, however, looked away. "Honoring doesn't erase what's left. I just wanted peace." Alexis didn't insist. She understood. Years of working as a medic in war zones had taught her that each person deals with pain in their own way. But even so, something inside her told her that he needed more than recognition, a reconnection with who he once was. That late afternoon, with the battery recharged and the car running, Alexis was about to leave, but she hesitated. She turned around, looked at James, and said firmly, "You may want peace, but you don't deserve to be forgotten." And she took her cell phone out of her pocket. Without saying anything else, she made a call. James didn't understand right away. He just heard her saying key words like Tagab Valley, Sergeant Matthews, and urgent update. It was as if Alexis had regained control of something she had left pending for years. When she hung up, she turned to him and added, "You don't have to do anything, but they'll want to know." James didn't answer. He felt a weight rise on his back, as if the past was coming back not to judge him, but to finally close a cycle. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. 2 days had passed since that conversation. The city was still shrouded in white, but the garage now seemed less cold, not because of the temperature, but because of what had changed inside. James went about his daily routine, checking engines, changing tires, drinking lukewarm coffee in silence. But with every sound from the road, his heart raced, as if he knew something was coming. And it did. It was 2:17 p.m. On a Wednesday, when an unusual sound tore through the sky, the sound of rotating blades. He left the garage confused, wiping his hands on the old rag he always used. And then he saw it. An Army Black Hawk helicopter landing in the open field in front of the garage, kicking up a cloud of snow and dirt that looked like a mini hurricane. The few locals who passed by stopped their cars, staring at the scene in astonishment. James stood still, his heart pounding, unsure whether he should run or wait. The side door of the helicopter opened, and 3 uniformed officers and a group of men of various ages descended, some with canes, others in worn military caps. James recognized one of the first before he could speak. It was Morales, his platoon's radio operator, now with white hair but the same smile as always. "I thought you were dead, stubborn sergeant," he shouted hoarsely. James felt the ground shake. He didn't respond. He couldn't. The other men approached, some with red eyes, others laughing nervously, as if the moment were too unreal to take in all at once. One of the officers carried a dark wooden box and a scroll. Within minutes, right there in front of the workshop that had been his hideout for almost 10 years, a circle had formed. No microphone, no spotlights, just people who knew exactly what this moment meant. Morales was the first to speak out loud, his posture trembling but full of pride. He told those present how James, even though he was wounded and with part of his face melted by the flames, carried 2 unconscious soldiers through an active combat zone under crossfire. He remembered the words he had heard from James himself that day. "If I'm going to die, I'm going to do it with them alive." Alexis, who had returned to the city especially for that moment, approached the circle and nodded silently, as if confirming each word with the weight of someone who had witnessed pain and courage up close. One by one, the veteran said James's name out loud, as if they were returning him to the world he had left behind. When the officer opened the box, everyone fell silent. Inside were 2 medals, the Purple Heart for a combat wound and the Navy Cross for extreme bravery under enemy fire. James looked at the objects and for a moment didn't know what to do. He had never expected or desired this, but he didn't refuse. He held out his hands firmly and received the medals as if he were finally accepting his own story. His palm trembled slightly, but his eyes were steady, fixed on the faces of those men, his brothers in arms, who had traveled for hours just to say, "We haven't forgotten." After the improvised ceremony, Alexis came over again and stood beside him, saying nothing. They just stood there, watching the helicopter take off with part of the group, while others stayed for a hot coffee in the workshop. James looked different. The tired look was still there, but it had gained something new. Maybe a restrained glow, maybe the lightness of someone who no longer had to carry everything alone. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged. The workshop, which had once been just a refuge from the world, had now become a meeting point, a symbol of return. Over the next week, James's shop began to receive visitors he never expected to see again. Veterans who had heard about the reunion began to show up, some just to shake his hand, others to ask for advice on cars, or simply to chat. Alexis, who had taken medical leave after years of continuous active duty, began to stop by frequently, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just to share the silence with him. As if he understood that healing doesn't always come with words. James reconnected the old radio to a larger antenna and started playing music outside as a sign that he was there. Slowly, the shop took on a new life. They hung a Marine Corps flag on the back wall, and Alexis helped organize a small shelf of old photos from the battalion. The past was still there, but it no longer suffocated him. On a clear morning, with no snow on the ground, Alexis arrived earlier than usual. She was carrying a thick envelope stamped by the Army. "They want me to return to active duty, coordination position, no field, but I'm thinking about turning it down," she said, with a discreet smile. James didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, as if trying to understand what that choice meant. "I think I can still help a lot of people, but now, maybe in a different way." "Here," James nodded. "You already have," he murmured. They both laughed quietly, as if sharing an old secret. It was clear that, more than rediscovering a face from the past, Alexis had rediscovered a part of herself. That doctor marked by losses and responsibilities, who had long harbored doubts about her worth, now found in her reunion with James the silent answer she was looking for. She had made a difference, and she could still do so. That afternoon, as the sun began to sink behind the snow-capped Montana mountains, James decided to close the shop an hour early. It wasn't often for him to do this, but on this particular day, he felt he needed some time to himself. He pulled out an old box he kept in the back of the storage room, one he hadn't had the courage to open since returning from the military hospital. Inside were old documents, field photos, a handwritten letter in his mother's shaky handwriting, and a small, twisted dog tag he'd worn pinned to his chest the day of the attack. He sat there for a few minutes on the cold, concrete floor, staring at the objects as if they were ghosts finally laid to rest. Then, with a care that didn't suit his calloused hands, he put them all in a new box, dusted them off with a rag, and carried them to the shelf next to the Marine Corps flag. Alexis entered silently and watched the scene without saying anything. She simply approached, picked up an empty frame that was on the counter, and placed inside it one of the oldest photos of the group. One in which James appeared, still without the scars, smiling alongside his colleagues. "I think this photo deserves a place here," she said, hanging it on the worn wooden wall. James watched, and for an instant, the hardened look of war faded into something lighter, a breath of acceptance, perhaps even peace. They remained side by side for a while, listening only to the sound of the wind outside and the soft crackling of the heater. The life that had previously been made of silence and distance now took on contours of coexistence, of sharing. There were no promises, no grandiose plans, just the certainty that despite everything, they were there. And that was already a lot. Days later, a small local newspaper published an article with the understated headline, "Montana's Quiet Hero Receives Recognition After 10 Years." The news spread through veterans communities and even reached military forums, where dozens of former comrades in arms left messages of thanks and admiration. James read some of them, but chose not to respond. For him, it was enough to know that someone remembered. Alexis, on the other hand, began working with a support group for military health professionals dealing with post-traumatic stress. She used her own story with James as an example of how the impact of a choice can last a decade and still make a difference. Together, they created a small, informal support network right there in Livingston, welcoming visitors, sharing experiences, and offering what those returning from war often lacked: listening, understanding, and space. James's shop never became a memorial, nor did he want it to. He continued to fix engines, adjust brakes, and charge fair prices. But now, hanging on the wall next to his tool bench, a simple plaque read, "We are not alone." Instead of returning to active duty, Alexis decided to settle permanently in the city. She rented a small house 2 blocks away and began volunteering as a medic in the surrounding area. They never put a label on what they were building, nor did they need to. They knew only that they had been 2 strangers brought together by war, then separated by time, and finally reconnected by chance or fate. And that, even after all that, it was still possible to start over. Sometimes the most important rescues don't happen on the battlefield. They happen long afterward, when someone is finally seen, heard, and remembered for what they did, but also for who they became.